The air in the holding room was a synthetic, refrigerated calm, a deliberate counterpoint to the tempest gathering outside its soundproofed walls. It smelled of catered sandwiches, untouched, and the faint, anxious perfume of hairspray. Here, in this sterile antechamber to the arena, Hillary Clinton sat, a portrait of unnerving stillness. The pantsuit, a stark militant white against the beige room, was her armor. Every fold was precise, every line deliberate. It was a uniform for a battle she had been fighting her entire life, a battle of perception, of expectation, of being a woman in a world of men who made the rules and then feigned outrage when she learned to play by them. Her face, a mask of practiced serenity, was the result of decades spent under the Klieg lights of public scrutiny. The muscles around her eyes were held in a state of relaxed readiness, the smile lines around her mouth prepared to curve into a familiar, reassuring arc at a moment's notice. It was a face that had graced the cover of a million magazines, been caricatured, praised, and vilified, but tonight, it was a fortress. Inside that fortress, a different war was being waged. Not a war of policy points, which she knew by heart. Their nuances and statistical underpinnings committed to memory with the encyclopedic recall of a scholar. It's not a war of debate tactics, which she had drilled with her team until every pivot, every parry, every pre-planned zinger felt like muscle memory. The war was against a ghost that lived in the digital ether, a ghost of her own making. The server, the emails. The words themselves had become a curse, a two-syllable incantation her enemies used to summon demons of mistrust and conspiracy. She had tried to exorcise it with logic, with legal explanations, with apologies that were parsed and dissected for their sincerity like ancient texts. She had called it a mistake, and she meant it. A colossal, short-sighted, politically naive mistake, born not of malice, but of a bone-deep desire for a sliver of privacy, a firewall against the relentless, invasive nature of public life. She had wanted a single, convenient device, a digital space that was hers alone, away from the prying eyes of a government bureaucracy she had never fully trusted, even while at its helm. It was a desire for control, the same instinct that drove her meticulous preparation, her disciplined messaging. And it was this very instinct that had betrayed her, creating the one thing she could not control, a narrative that had grown wild and monstrous. Fed by the outrage machine of her opponents, her team moved around her with the hushed reverence of acolytes. Huma Abedin, a shadow of calm confidence, checked her phone, her face a neutral mask that betrayed nothing. John Podesta, his brow permanently furrowed with the weight of 1,000 potential crises, reviewed a final sheet of notes, though he knew she didn't need them. Robbie Mook, the Boy Wonder campaign manager, exuded a nervous energy that he tried to contain by pacing the edge of the room, his mind running through polling data and demographic trends, trying to quantify the unquantifiable tide of public emotion. They all believed in her. They believed in the historic nature of her candidacy, in the rightness of her cause. But they too felt the chill of the ghost. They saw it in the trekking polls, a slow, almost imperceptible erosion of the trustworthy and honest metric. It was the campaign's original sin, a wound that refused to heal, and tonight they all knew. Her opponent would come for it with a rusty knife. She closed her eyes for a moment, shutting out the sterile room, and let the internal litany run its course one last time. It was allowed. Nothing was marked classified at the time of sending or receiving. Colin Powell did something similar. It was a matter of convenience. The State Department has the vast majority of them. It was a mistake. I take responsibility. The phrases were smooth, worn stones in her mind, polished by endless repetition in prep sessions. They were legally and technically correct. They were her shield. But she knew with a certainty that settled like ice in her stomach that shields were useless against a firestorm. Her opponent didn't deal in facts, he dealt in feelings. He didn't build arguments, he threw bombs. A knock on the door, soft but firm. It was time. She rose, and the movement was fluid, graceful, betraying none of the internal tension. She smoothed the front of her jacket, a gesture of settling into character. As she walked towards the door, the ambient noise of the building, began to leak in the murmur of the crowd, the distant thrum of generators, the electric hum of anticipation. She placed a hand on the cool metal of the door handle, took a single, deep, centering breath, and prepared to step into the light. Her public smile, the one of practiced warmth and unflappable confidence, clicked into place. The fortress was secure. The ghost was locked away. For now, across the campus, in another, more chaotic holding room. The atmosphere was not one of refrigerated calm, but of a caged animal's den. The air was thick with the smell of fast food and fury. Donald Trump paced the floor, his large frame seeming to shrink the space around him. His suit was dark, his tie a slash of blood red, a statement of aggression.
He wasn't still.
He was a coil of restless energy, his hands constantly in motion, adjusting his cuffs, gesturing as he spoke to the small circle of aides who orbited him like nervous moons. He was a man cornered, wounded, and enraged.
Hours
Had been a political inferno, a tape. The Access Hollywood tape. The words, his own words, crude and predatory, had been played on a loop, a soundtrack to his political obituary. The party was abandoning him. The pundits had declared him finished. The weight of it all, the humiliation, had settled on him not as a burden, but as fuel. He wasn't thinking about policy. Policy was for losers, for the swamp creatures who used jargon and statistics to hypnotize the public. He was thinking about survival. He was thinking about revenge. His mind was a maelstrom of grievances, a highlight reel of every perceived slight, every attack, every betrayal. He saw their faces, the smug news anchors, the backstabbing Republican establishment figures, the condescending academics, and at the center of it all, he saw her face. Hillary Clinton, crooked Hillary. To him, she was not just an opponent. She was the embodiment of the corrupt, globalist elite system that he had built his entire campaign against. She was the architect of his current humiliation, the smiling, sanctimonious beneficiary of the media's coordinated attack. His preparation was not a study of binders, but a communion with his own instincts. Steve Bannon, a spectral presence in the corner, watched with a grim, approving smirk. He had encouraged this, stoked the fire. Forget the apology tour. Forget trying to be presidential. That was her game. His game was to be the wrecking ball. Kellyanne Conway, ever the translator of his raw ID into palatable sound bites, tried to offer gentle course corrections, but she knew that tonight the beast had to be unleashed. This was not about winning on points. This was about changing the subject. It was about creating a moment so shocking, so transgressive, that it would obliterate the memory of the tape. It was about scorched earth, and he had his weapon. The emails, it was perfect. It was everything the tape wasn't. The tape was about his character, his vulgarity. The emails were about her character, her corruption, her criminality. It was a clean, righteous cudgel. Didn't care about the nuances of classified markings or the legal precedents of the Federal Records Act. That was swamp talk. He cared about the simple, brutal narrative. She deleted 33,000 emails. What was she hiding? She lied. She broke the law. She put the country in danger. Simple, powerful, repetitive. He rolled the words around in his mind, feeling their weight, their sharp edges. Acid wash, bleach bit, special prosecutor, jail. The last word tasted like victory. It was a line that had never been crossed in American politics. A banana republic threat. It was perfect. It was exactly the kind of grenade he needed to throw. He wasn't nervous. He was alive. The prospect of combat, of pure, unadulterated conflict, animated him. He saw the stage not as a forum for debate, but as a coliseum. The audience, the moderators, the cameras, they were just spectators to a fight to the death. He would walk out there, look her in the eye, and he would not see a former Secretary of State, a former First Lady. He would see an enemy, and he would try to destroy her. He caught his reflection in the dark glass of a television screen. The hair, a golden helmet. The scowl, a mask of defiance. The red tie, a promise of the fight to come. He felt the adrenaline surge, a familiar, intoxicating rush. This was his element. The chaos was his home. He gave a sharp, decisive nod, not to anyone in particular, but to the reflection, to the moment. It was time to go to war. The walk from the holding rooms to the stage was a journey through a canyon of manufactured silence. Wires snaked across the floor like thick black vines. Technicians with headsets spoke in hushed, urgent tones. The two candidates, separated by a protocol-mandated distance, did not look at each other. He walked with a heavy, deliberate tread, a fighter entering the ring. She walked with a measured, almost gliding pace, a stateswoman ascending a rostrum. The first collision was not of words, but of bodies failing to connect. They reached their respective positions behind their chairs. The moderators, Anderson Cooper and Martha Raddatz, stood between them, emblems of a civility that was about to be shattered. The audience, a curated collection of undecided voters, sat in tiered rows, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. The tradition, the simple human gesture that signaled a shared respect for the democratic process, was the handshake. He made no move. His hands remained at his sides, his face a granite slab of hostility. She, seeing his posture, offered only a curt, almost imperceptible nod in his direction, her own hands clasping in front of her. The space between them crackled with a cold, negative energy. The non-handshake was a declaration. The rules were gone. The niceties were over. The battle had begun before a single question was asked. The moderator stood, beacons of a rapidly eroding order. Their voices, crisp and authoritative, laid out the town hall format. The questions would come from the citizens, a promise of genuine, unscripted interaction. But the air was already scripted with a palpable tension. Candidates took their seats. The first few questions were probes, explorations of policy, of character. He prowled, didn't stay seated. He roamed the small patch of red carpet. A restless predator in his territory, often looming in her camera shot, a physical manifestation of his invasive strategy. He used his body as an instrument of intimidation, a constant looming presence. She remained, for the most part, seated or stood gracefully at her designated spot, a bastion of composure against his kinetic aggression. She answered the initial questions with the crisp precision she had rehearsed, pivoting to her strengths, to her vision of a collaborative, forward-looking America. She spoke of policy, of plans, of unity. She was building a case. He was looking for an opening. Every answer she gave, he met with a dismissive grunt, shake of the head, a muttered wrong into his microphone. Interrupted, he hectored, he spoke over the moderators. He was a force of pure disruption, seeking to unravel the very fabric of the debate. He called her a liar, he called her the devil. He deflected questions about the tape with a brusque, dismissive wave, labeling it locker room talk before immediately counterpunching, bringing up Bill Clinton's past, a calculated, ugly move, designed to wound her personally, to throw her off balance. He paraded women who had accused her husband of assault in a pre-debate press conference, piece of political theater so brutal and unprecedented it left even seasoned journalists aghast. He was burning down the house, and he didn't care who got caught in the flames. She held firm. The smile remained, though it was now brittle, a thin veneer of civility over a core of cold fury. Eyes, when the camera caught them in close-up, revealed the strain. This was what she had prepared for, but the reality of it, the sheer, unvarnished ugliness of his attack, was still a shock to the system. She absorbed the blows, parried them with practiced lines about going high when they go low, but with every attack, a piece of her carefully constructed presidential aura was chipped away. He was dragging her down into the mud, and the audience, the country, was watching her get dirty. The ghost in her mind began to stir. She knew it was coming. Every pivot he made, every mention of lies and deception was a prelude. He was circling, tightening the noose, waiting for the perfect moment to strike at the heart of her vulnerability. Then, the moment arrived. It came from a moderator's question, a direct inquiry from Martha Raddatz, about the emails, about her judgment. The ghost was no longer a whisper in her mind. It was now manifest, spoken aloud in the arena, broadcast to 100 million people. The room seemed to grow quieter, the air thinner. This was the precipice. She began her answer. It was the answer she had rehearsed 1,000 times. It's the shield of worn, smooth phrases. It was a mistake. Take responsibility for that. There's no evidence that any classified material ended up in the wrong hands. She spoke calmly, her voice even, her gaze directed at the questioner. She was the picture of accountability, of a leader acknowledging a past error and moving on. She tried to pivot, to contrast her minor technical error with his major character flaws. His temperament, his unfitness for office. It was the smart, strategic response. It was the textbook political answer, but he wasn't playing by the textbook. He was still roaming the stage, and as she spoke, he moved closer to his microphone. His eyes narrowed, a predator sensing weakness. He let her finish her polished, lawyerly explanation. He let the words hang in the air for a beat, words of contrition and context. And then he stepped forward, grabbed his microphone, and detonated his bomb. He didn't debate her points. He ignored the legal nuances. He went straight for the simple, visceral, gut-level accusation. He spoke not to the moderator, not to her, but directly to the camera, to the people watching at home. He painted a picture of criminality, of high treason. He spoke of the 33,000 bleached emails. He used the term acid wash, a phrase so bizarre and specific, it sounded like something from a spy thriller, making it instantly memorable. He wasn't making an argument. He was telling a story. A story of a corrupt queen who thought she was above the law. She watched him. Her face a carefully composed mask, but her mind was racing. Don't react. Don't let him get under your skin. He's performing. This is theater. She tried to hold on to the high ground, to project an image of a serious person being assailed by a madman. But his words were landing. They were cutting through the noise, through the complexities of the issue, and delivering a single devastating message. She is a criminal. And then he delivered the line he had been saving, the line that would define the night, the line that would echo through the rest of the campaign. If I win, he said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl, I am going to instruct my attorney general to get a special prosecutor to look into your situation. He paused, letting the threat sink in, his gaze fixed on her. Because there has never been so many lies, so much deception. There's never been anything like it. We're going to have a special prosecutor. The audience let out a collective audible gasp. It was a sound of shock, of a fundamental norm being violated. In the history of American presidential debates, this had never happened. An opponent hadn't just promised to defeat their rival, they had promised to imprison them. It was the language of a despot, of a third-world dictator. The moderators looked stunned, and then he added the final two-word flourish, the line that would become a chant. A meme, a rallying cry. Because you'd be in jail? Silence. A split second of profound, stunned silence in the hall. The ghost of the emails was no longer a ghost. It was now a specter of iron bars in a prison cell. He had not just questioned her judgment. He had passed sentence. From her chair, Hillary Clinton felt the floor drop out from beneath her. For a fleeting microsecond, the fortress of her composure was breached. It was a shock so profound, so beyond the pale of political discourse, that her mind struggled to process it. All the prep, all the strategy, it hadn't accounted for this. This was not a political attack. It was a promise of political persecution. A flash of pure, unadulterated anger surged through her, so hot and fast it almost cracked her mask. The sheer effrontery, the gall of this man, this reality TV star, this peddler of conspiracies. This embodiment of everything she had fought against, to stand on a stage and threaten to jail his political opponent. It was a desecration of the democratic process. But then, almost as quickly as the anger came, the discipline kicked in. Decades of training took over. He overplayed his hand. A voice in her head, cool and analytical, asserted, "This is not America. People will see this for what it is, the ranting of a would-be tyrant." She saw an opportunity. He had crossed a line, and she could now position herself as the defender of the Republic, the guardian of democratic norms. She let out a small, almost imperceptible laugh. It was a sound of disbelief, of contemptuous amusement. Head slowly, a gesture that conveyed both pity and disdain. When she spoke, her voice was laced with a calm, cutting irony. "It's just awfully good," she said, looking out at the audience, making them her co-conspirators in disbelief that someone with the temperament of Donald Trump is not in charge of the law in our country. For her line shot back, "Because you'd be in jail." He doubled down. He was proud of the line, repeated it, hammering it home. The exchange was over in less than a minute, but a tectonic plate had shifted in the American political landscape. In the control room, the director knew he had the moment. He cut to a split screen. On one side, Trump, scowling, defiant, a populist. Avenger on the other, Clinton, with her tight, forced smile, her look of weary condescension. It was the perfect visual encapsulation of the entire election, the raging, anti-establishment firebrand versus the cool, composed, but seemingly defensive embodiment of the status quo. The image burned itself onto the retinas of the nation. For the rest of the debate, a new, darker energy filled the room. The ghost of the emails now sat in the chair beside her. Every answer she gave, every policy she explained, was now heard through the filter of his accusation. Was this the talk of a future president, or the desperate deflection of a criminal? He had successfully poisoned the well. It changed the narrative. Conversation was no longer about his locker room talk. It was about her deleted emails. It was about whether she belonged in the White House or the Big House. She battled on, displaying a fortitude that was, in itself, remarkable. She answered questions about Syria, about healthcare, about the Supreme Court. She was knowledgeable. She was steady. She was presidential. But the shadow of his threat lingered over every word. He had managed to do what no opponent had ever done. He had put her on trial in the middle of a presidential debate. When it finally ended, with a bizarre final question about what they respected in each other, desperate attempt by a voter to inject a sliver of humanity back into the proceedings, the tension did not dissipate. She offered a strained compliment about his children. He, in a rare moment of seeming magnanimity, praised her as a fighter who never gives up. It was a brief, surreal truce. Then they moved to the center of the stage. This time there was a handshake. It was quick, perfunctory, a cold and meaningless gesture. As their hands touched, a jolt of mutual animosity, of pure, unadulterated dislike, seemed to pass between them. Then they turned and walked away, two warriors retreating to their corners, leaving the battlefield littered with the norms of a bygone era. She walked off the stage, the practiced smile melting from her face the moment she was out of the camera's line of sight. The adrenaline that had sustained her for 90 minutes drained away, replaced by a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. It was the exhaustion not just of a single debate, but of a lifetime spent under attack. In the sterile holding room, the silence was heavy. Her team looked at her, their faces a mixture of admiration for her resilience and horror at what they had just witnessed. Huma handed her a bottle of water, her hands steady, but her eyes filled with a concern that went beyond politics. Podesta, his face grim, simply nodded. There were no words of congratulations, no declarations of victory. They had survived. That was all. She sank into a chair, the white pantsuit now feeling less like armor and more like a costume. She closed her eyes, and the sounds of the debate replayed in her mind. His growling voice, the gasp of the audience, her own strained, ironic response, and the words, "You'd be in jail." The phrase echoed a discordant, menacing clang. She had thought his comment would be seen as a disqualifying moment of authoritarianism. She had believed the public, the press, would be repulsed by such a blatant violation of democratic principles. She had won the exchange on decorum, on substance, on basic human decency. But a cold knot of dread was forming in her gut. Played chess, moving her pieces with precision and care. He had flipped the board over and declared himself king. She was beginning to fear that in the America of 2016, the man who flipped the board might just be the one who wins. The ghost was not vanquished. It was stronger than ever. It was now wearing a prosecutor's robes. In his own holding room, there was no exhaustion. There was only pure, uncut exhilaration. Donald Trump was electric, triumphant. He felt the victory in his bones. He had landed the punch. He had changed the story. The Access Hollywood tape felt like a distant memory, a minor skirmish before the main event. His aides, Bannon and Conway, were ecstatic. They knew they had their moment. The jail line, which would send establishment Republicans and media elites into a frenzy of pearl clutching, was pure red meat for his base. It was the ultimate validation of their belief that the system was rigged, that she was corrupt, and that he, and only he, was strong enough to clean it up. He replayed the moment in his head, savoring it like a fine wine, a look on her face. The shock in the room, it was beautiful. It was television. It was power. He had broken her composure, he believed. It exposed her as the criminal he always said she was. He wasn't thinking about democratic norms or the peaceful transfer of power. He was thinking about ratings. He was thinking about polls. He was thinking about winning. As he left the building, surrounded by a phalanx of security, he saw the scrum of reporters, their cameras flashing, their voices shouting questions. He didn't stop. He just gave them a wide, predatory grin and a thumbs up. The message was clear. The game has changed, and I am in control. The aftermath was immediate and overwhelming. The media, which had been poised to write Trump's political obituary, was now in a state of frenzied delirium. The debate was not just a political event. It was a cultural explosion. The next 24 hours were a blur of cable news panels, screaming headlines, and endless social media loops. The split screen of Trump's scowl and Clinton's tight smile was everywhere. The phrase "you'd be in jail" became the central axis around which all analysis revolved. Pundits on one side of the aisle declared it a horrifying breach, a step towards authoritarianism, proof of his unfitness for office. They wrung their hands, citing historical precedents, warning of a constitutional crisis. They were the keepers of the old rules, and they watched in horror as he lit them on fire. On the other side, commentators praised it as a moment of authentic populist rage, a brilliant strategic move that spoke directly to the forgotten man. They saw it not as a threat, but as a promise to hold the powerful accountable. But in this new media ecosystem, the nuance of the debate was lost. The substance of the arguments dissolved. What remained were the moments, the images, the feelings. The story was no longer about policy differences. The story was Trump threatens to jail Clinton. And for a significant portion of the electorate, the subtext of that headline was not Trump threatens democracy, but Clinton might belong in jail. The ghost of the emails, now supercharged by his accusation, broke free from the confines of the political blogosphere and took up permanent residence in the mainstream consciousness. It was no longer a complicated story about private servers and classification levels. It was a simple, powerful narrative of crime and punishment. He had successfully reframed the conversation. The burden of proof was no longer on him to defend. His character was on her to prove her innocence. In the days that followed, the Clinton campaign felt the ground shifting beneath them. They had believed, or perhaps desperately wanted to believe, that his debate performance would backfire, that voters would be repulsed by his aggression and his threats. Their internal polling in the immediate aftermath showed a slight bump, a win on points among likely voters. The professional political class agreed. But they were measuring with an old ruler. They were analyzing a game whose rules had been rewritten without their consent. Out on the campaign trail, the change was palpable. Hillary Clinton tried to move on. She gave speeches about her economic plans, about children's health insurance, about foreign policy. She was disciplined, focused, presidential. But the ghost followed her everywhere. At every rally, a new and ominous chant would rise from the crowds of Trump supporters gathered to protest her events. Lock her up. Lock her up. The chant was a direct echo of his debate threat, a tribal roar that reduced a complex political contest to a call for vengeance. It was loud, it was persistent, and it was unnerving. The press, too, was relentless. Every press conference, Every gaggle on her campaign plane began with the same question, phrased a dozen different ways. Secretary Clinton, can you respond to Donald Trump's threat to imprison you? Secretary Clinton, why should voters trust you when 33,000 emails were deleted? She would give her practiced, patient answers, trying to steer the conversation back to policy, back to what she believed truly mattered to the American people. But it was like trying to redirect a river with a teaspoon. The narrative was set. She was the defensive, untrustworthy establishment figure. He was the agent of change, the avenging angel. The public trust, that fragile, intangible currency of politics, continued to erode. The phenomenon was visible not in a sudden collapse, but in a slow, steady leak. In focus groups held in swing states like Ohio and Pennsylvania, the shift was clear. Voters who had been leaning her way, often reluctantly, now had a new, concrete reason for their hesitation. A woman in a suburban Cleveland diner, a lifelong Democrat, confessed to a pollster that, while she thought Trump was a maniac, the email thing just felt wrong. She couldn't articulate the legal specifics, but the image of secrecy, of deletion, of special treatment, had lodged itself in her mind. A laid-off factory worker in Scranton, a man who had voted for Obama twice, but was now considering Trump, saw the debate as proof of his worldview. Just crooked, he'd say, shrugging. They all are. At least he's honest about being a bastard. The complex reality of the situation, that the FBI, under James Comey, had already investigated and recommended no charges, calling her actions extremely careless but not criminal, was lost in the fog of war. His simple, brutal lie was more powerful than her complicated, unsatisfying truth. Careless was a weak, bureaucratic word. Jail was a strong, simple one. For Hillary Clinton, these were days of quiet, mounting desperation. She maintained her public composure, the steely smile, the unwavering confidence. But her team saw the strain. They saw the flash of frustration in her eyes when another reporter asked about the server. They felt the weariness in her voice at the end of a long day of campaigning, only to turn on the television and see her opponent's face, his words, her alleged crimes, replayed on an endless loop. She had dedicated her life to public service, had amassed a deeper and more detailed knowledge of policy than perhaps any presidential candidate in modern history. And it was all being erased, overshadowed by a ghost, a mistake, a damn email. Server. It was a political tragedy playing out in slow motion. A story of a woman who was, in many ways, perfectly prepared for a presidency she could no longer be certain she would win. The path to victory, which had once seemed so clear, so inevitable, was now shrouded in a thick, noxious fog of suspicion. The debate had not been a knockout blow in the traditional sense, but it had inflicted a deep internal wound. It had given her enemies their rallying cry and her wavering supporters their justification for doubt. The ghost was feeding, growing, stronger with every news cycle, every chant. Every seed of doubt planted in a voter's mind. The final weeks of the campaign became a frantic race against this narrative. She campaigned with a relentless energy, crisscrossing the country, trying to shout over the noise with her message of hope and competence. But the chant followed her. Lock her up. It became the soundtrack to her final push, a constant taunting, a reminder of the hole she was in. She was no longer just running against Donald Trump. She was running against a caricature of herself. It's a ghost story that had taken on a life of its own. Then 11 days before the election, the ghost became flesh. She was on her campaign plane, flying between rallies, the hum of the engines, a familiar lullaby of the trail. The mood was cautiously optimistic. The polls had stabilized. The damage from the debate seemed contained. It looked like she might just weather the storm. An aide, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly, approached her. He held a phone, the screen glowing with a news alert. He didn't need to say anything. She saw the words, "The FBI, James Comey, a letter to Congress." The investigation was being reopened. New emails had been discovered. They were on a laptop belonging to Anthony Weiner, the disgraced husband of her closest aide, Huma Abedin. The world inside the cabin of the plane seemed to stop. Hum of the engines faded into a distant roar. The faces of her staff blurred into masks of disbelief and horror. Time itself seemed to slow down, to stretch, to become thick and suffocating. It was a blow so sudden, so perfectly timed for maximum political damage, that it felt like a physical assault. It was the materialization of her deepest fears. The ultimate victory of the ghost she had been fighting for more than a year. All the work, all the speeches, all the policy papers, all the miles traveled, all the hands shaken it, all seemed to vanish in that one blinding flash of terrible news. The narrative that Trump had so brutally and effectively hammered home at the debate, that she was a criminal under investigation, that her corruption was not a settled matter, but an ongoing threat, had just received its official, devastating validation from the director of the FBI. It was no longer just a political attack from a rival. It was now a breaking news banner on every television screen in America. Hillary Clinton sat in her seat, the phone with the news alert still glowing in her aide's hand. She looked out the small oval window at the clouds below, a vast, indifferent sea of white. The sun was shining brightly up here, above the weather. But she knew that down on the ground, a political hurricane had just made landfall. She felt not a surge of anger, not a wave of panic, but a slow, crushing wave of resignation. A profound, soul-deep weariness. It was the feeling of a marathon runner, feet from the finish line, being told the race has been extended, and her legs are now shackled with weights. She had fought. She had fought her entire life, against sexism, against the political machine, against the endless scrutiny and the double standards. She had fought him on the debate stage, absorbing his ugliest blows and standing tall. She had fought the ghost of her own mistake, trying to banish it with reason and facts. But she now understood with a chilling and absolute clarity that she had lost. Not the election, not yet. But she had lost control of the story. And in modern American politics, the story was the only thing that mattered. The final image was not of a fall from grace in a single dramatic moment. It was of a slow, inexorable descent, played out in the sterile, pressurized cabin of a campaign plane, high above a country that was no longer listening to her. It was the image of a woman of immense power and intellect, a woman who had come closer to the presidency than any woman before her, finally, and completely trapped by the ghost of her own making. A ghost that her opponent had expertly summoned and unleashed upon the world. The unresolved dilemma hung heavy in the silent air of the cabin. Was this the consequence of her own flawed judgment, deserved political comeuppance? Or was it the tragic triumph of a new, brutal kind of politics, where truth was irrelevant, and the loudest, angriest voice always wins? As the plane began its descent, bringing her back down to the storm, she had no answer. There was only the ghost, sitting beside her now, its cold presence a promise of the darkness to come.